Hello, everyone, and welcome to Climate Resilience Happens at the Local Level. We're so excited you could join us today. My name is Lindsay Rogers, and I'm WaterNow's Colorado Basin Program Manager, and I'll be our session lead today. And I'm joined by my colleague, Jesse Bershinger, who will be providing tech support. And before we dive in, we're just going to cover a few housekeeping items. Today, we'll be using the Pathable Polling tab on your session description page, where you access the link for this session for both polling questions and to submit your questions for our speakers. You'll answer the polls by clicking on the green vote button, submitting your answer, and then scrolling down to the next polling question. And then you can ask questions of the speakers by clicking the enter your own or vote link and submitting your question. You can also like or upvote other attendees' questions by clicking on the thumbs up icon to the left of the question. You can submit your tech or logistics related questions to Jesse and I through the Pathable chat feature. And we'll be starting today's session in plenary with presentations from our speakers, and then we'll move into small discussion groups. So once in your breakout rooms, we encourage you to turn on your video and audio by clicking on the speaker and video icons in the bottom left corner of your screen. And lastly, this session recording will be available following the session on the session description page. Next slide, please. So now I'd like to introduce you to Nicole Lampe, our moderator for today's session. Nicole is the manager for the Water Hub at Climate Nexus and has worked in cause communications for over 15 years, helping advocates make a health, equity, and economic case for environmental protection. She honed her skills at the Trust for Public Land and Resource Media and now leads the Water Hub at Climate Nexus as the managing director, excuse me. Thank you, Nicole.
Thanks, Lindsay. Excited to be here. And I would love to introduce our other speakers, starting with Jay Familietti, Executive Director of the Global Institute for Water Security at University of Saskatchewan. Jay is a professor of hydrology and Executive Director of the Global Institute for Water Security, as I said. Previously, Jay served as the Senior Water Scientist at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, using satellites and advanced computer models to track how freshwater availability is changing around the globe. Next, we have Bart Weiss, Chief Officer of Innovation and Resiliency at Hillsborough County Public Utilities. Excuse me. Bart has over 28 years of experience in water supply resiliency, where he's a leader in potable reuse nationally and in Florida. During his involvement in multiple innovative and resilience projects and programs in 2018, Mr. Weiss was appointed to establish Hillsborough County's Innovation and Resiliency Office, which spans climate change and sea level rise to One Water initiatives. Jared Biggs is Assistant Utilities Director at the City of Durango. There, Jared manages day-to-day operation of the city's water and sewer utilities, as well as long-term resiliency efforts, including replacement of aging infrastructure, community growth, wildfire resilience, and investment in redundancy to prepare for climate variability. And lastly, we have Peter Kelly Detweiler of Northbridge Energy Partners, LLC. Peter is the co-founder of Northbridge Energy Partners and has 30 years of experience in the electric energy arena. He writes for Forbes.com and other publications on topics related to disruptive innovation and its impact on electricity infrastructure. And now we'd love to hear from you to help frame up our conversation. So please head over to the Pathable agenda page, where we will ask you 3 questions about your community's experience with climate change and the intersection of climate and water specifically. And you can see on the screen a little demo for how to get there. Okay. Thanks to those of you who filled out the poll. We are going to screen share the results so that you can hear from the other participants. So starting at the top, it looks like 59% of participants have seen climate-related events in their communities in the past year. 16% in the past 2 to 5 years, and 13% each in either the 5 to 10 year range or not sure. Next, we asked about what climate impacts your community is experiencing. And it looks like there was a huge range of responses, with extreme weather and storms and drought topping the list, followed closely by flooding, water pollution, heat waves, air pollution, and lastly, sea level rise. And then finally, we asked what word comes to mind when thinking about climate and water. And the top answer was inextricable, followed by flooding, hopeful, fire, drought, actually fire twice, and scary. Thanks for sharing. I think that you'll be hearing a lot about the range of impacts that communities are experiencing, as well as the solutions that communities and utilities are pioneering. And we're going to now start by hearing from Jay Familietti. And after each speaker, we'll have some time for Q&A. And then after that, as Lindsay shared, we'll be going into breakout sessions where we can continue our discussion in small groups.
Shall I take it away? I will. Okay. Let me set the stage for our session by painting the big picture about how our freshwater landscape is changing and what it means for resilience at the community level. I'll do that by sharing some of our satellite-based research that my team has performed over the last quarter century. This is work that we've done using NASA's GRACE satellites, where GRACE stands for Gravity Recovery and Climate Experiment. So I'll explain how the satellites work. I'll show you a global picture of our results. We'll drill down into a case study of California. I'll talk more about what it means for local water managers. And I'll finish up with a call for more transdisciplinary research, meaning more collaboration and more co-development of research problems where, for example, local water or utility managers and researchers at universities work together rather than in the silos that are so common. So here's the GRACE mission. It launched in 2002, ran until the end of 2017. Most of the work I'll present today is based on these data. The GRACE follow-on or GRACE FO mission launched in May 2018. Almost exactly the same configuration, which delivers data at the same space-time resolution as the GRACE mission. GRACE is unusual for a satellite in that it functions more like a scale rather than, say, an optical satellite, which is effectively taking pictures, or a satellite that senses temperature or other emissions from the surface. GRACE literally weighs the water storage changes over land by tracking the gravitational tug on these two satellites and the resulting changes in their orbits very accurately at the submicron level, so that we can map out the regions of the world that are gaining or losing water mass on a monthly basis just by watching the ups and downs of these satellites. GRACE measures the changes in total water storage, not the absolute amount, but the change over time. And by total water storage, I mean all of the snow, the surface water, the soil moisture, and the groundwater together at monthly and longer timescales, and for regions that are greater than 150,000 square kilometers. Next slide, please. Well, here's what the GRACE mission showed us. It allowed us to produce this first of its kind map of the trends in the changes in total water storage over the lifetime of the mission. The blue colors represent those areas that gained water mass over the time period, and the red colors are those that are losing water mass. There's a broad background pattern of blues at the high and the low latitudes and reds in the mid latitudes, so that the high and the low latitudes are getting wetter, and in between the mid latitudes are getting drier. And then there's these darker hotspots that are sprinkled on top of this of the map. These hotspots are places, for example, as shown by the deep red spots, where the Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets are melting, or that the glaciers in Alaska or Colombia or Peru or Patagonia are melting. Or they're places where the extremes of flooding or drought were on the rise during the lifetime of the mission. For example, the dark blues, that highlight the floods in the upper Midwestern US or the Amazon or the Okavango in Africa, or the deep reds that represent the droughts in Brazil, Central Europe, Madagascar or Malaysia. And there's this other set of hotspots that represents the world's major aquifers. And those are being rapidly depleted of their groundwater, mostly to support agriculture. Groundwater supplies nearly half of the water for irrigation around the world. And the red hotspots in California's Central Valley, in the southern high plains, in the Middle East, northwestern India, Bangladesh, around Beijing, the Canning Basin in northwestern Australia, in southern Africa, and the Huarani Aquifer in South America. Over half the world's major aquifers are past sustainability tipping points. Withdrawals are vastly outstripping replenishment rates. And these deep red spots are the warning signs that show that our water bank accounts in those regions are literally in the deep, deep red. Next slide, please. So let's drill down into a case study of California groundwater depletion in the Central Valley. I mentioned earlier that the GRACE satellites measure changes in the total water storage, all of the snow, surface water, soil moisture, groundwater together. If we want to use the GRACE mission to isolate just the groundwater, well, that's a lot more work. I won't get into it today, except to say that my team pioneered the methods starting in 2002. And we and our colleagues have done focused regional studies in virtually all of those red groundwater hotspots in the last slide. So this is our latest on California's Central Valley and how it's been changing. The groundwater has been changing there for almost the last 2 decades. What we see is this very recognizable feature of Central Valley groundwater, an overall downward trend with short periods of recharge during wetter winters, followed by longer periods of decline. Next slide, please. This leads to an overall decline in California's water availability, as we see in this image, which was produced from the GRACE data and that we released in 2014. Next slide, please. And we see a long-term picture that looks like this. This slide shows the cumulative change in groundwater storage in the Central Valley. The time period on the slide is actually wrong. The actual time period is 1962 to 2020, so about 60 years. This slide combines data from the US Geological Survey, shown in red, and the GRACE data, shown in blue. The colors in the background represent what's happening with climate and rainfall. Wet periods are shown in the dark blue, droughts are shown in dark tan, moderately wet periods are in the light blue, moderately dry periods are in the light tan. The long-term picture is one of 6 decades of decline. As in the GRACE chart that I showed you, we see some recovery in the wet periods, but a lot more decline in the dry periods, when people and agriculture rely far more heavily on groundwater. The negative impacts are clear: falling water tables, subsidence of the land surface, the need to dig deeper, more expensive wells, the higher cost of pumping groundwater from greater depths, declining water quality, depletion of rivers. Next slide, please. The picture that emerges globally is this: the human fingerprint on the freshwater landscape through climate change, ice melt, changing extremes, and water management, as in the case of groundwater, is a dominant force that is dramatically changing patterns of water availability. The change, with it, major threats to food security and water security, is happening far more rapidly than most people realize. The message that I want to leave this group is that climate change and the increasing frequency of flooding and drought and the disappearance of groundwater, which is so important for agriculture, for municipal water supplies, and for climate resilience, is making the job of managing water extremely complicated. We can't ignore what I've shown you, and we can't simply work in our silos. We, researchers in universities, and you, local water leaders, need to get out of our comfort zones and work together to affect change. What I've shown you in these figures is not going to change on its own. Climate change won't slow down unless we make it slow down. Groundwater won't stop disappearing unless we make it stop. On my end, my simply publishing another research paper isn't going to help water management up here in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, where I am. That's why I'm working with the city to identify a number of projects for collaboration between the city and our university. I encourage you to seek out similar collaborations. If I can be of any help as a matchmaker, I'll be happy to do just that to help you out. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Jay. And just checking the chat. Reminder that you can submit questions for our speakers in Pathable, the same agenda page where you took the poll. Maybe we'll zoom through and then we'll accept questions for Jay. If they come in, we can intersperse them after other speakers because we're just getting the hang of this particular style. Thank you, Jay. And next we'd love to hear from Bart Weiss.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the introduction. And I'm going to zoom in on Florida rather than the world. That was a great speak that preceded this. Drink Like an Astronaut, the title is basically due to potable reuse and the need for California and other states that are water restricted and need more water to recycle water completely. The astronauts have it. And if you take away one message from this speech, it would be judge water by its quality, not its history. All water is recycled. Doesn't matter. Next slide. So I'm in Florida, and most people know where Florida is. Next slide. And then I'm in the central west coast of Florida, Tampa Bay, or locally or recently known as Tampa Bay. Next slide. So this area, we have the Tampa Bay Regional Planning Council, which over 6 counties in this region, we work together, not only on transportation, but environmental issues. Next slide. Within the Tampa Bay Regional Planning Council, we have a resiliency effort known as the Tampa Bay Regional Resiliency Coalition. The same members belong to the Resiliency Coalition, where we work together in collaboration to work on resiliency issues, not only locally, but regionally. Next slide. One of the big threats in our area, we live on Tampa Bay. Hillsborough County is a western or eastern coastline of Tampa Bay. And we see that since 1946, Tampa Bay, the sea level rise in Tampa Bay has been 7.8, almost 8 inches. Next slide. So the forecast for this is what we're paying attention to now and trying to figure out what we need to do to become more resilient in case we get any one of these 3 scenarios. The NOAA intermediate low, which would be 2 feet of sea level rise by 2100. The intermediate would be 4 feet of sea level rise, and then the high would be over 8 feet of sea level rise. You can imagine the changes that have to make if we were to see 8 feet of sea level rise. Next slide. So what do you do when you realize that? You work on a vulnerability, that is what industries, what communities are vulnerable from not only sea level rise, but due to sea level rise, you get exacerbated storm surge. Next slide, please. So what we did is we worked together with the University of South Florida, and we created a vulnerability study about our coastal areas and riverine systems. As you can see, there's a lot of water in Hillsborough County. Everything blue is water. So we looked at the various storm levels. That's a category 1 hurricane, category 3, category 5. And then we looked at the storm surge with high and intermediate sea level rise. So we looked at the variation of sea level rise, and therefore you can see the variation on the coastal areas of the different storm levels and sea level rise levels. Next slide, please. So this is an example of one of more than 70 variables that we stuck into this modeling exercise, and this is residential property. So you can see various densities of residential property from low, medium, high, and others. Next slide, please. We then also looked at mobile homes. Mobile homes are very susceptible to high winds and hurricane issues. So you can see along the coast, we would focus our efforts first along those coastal riverine systems where we see these motor homes or mobile homes for evacuation purposes and possibly future resiliency work. Next slide. We also looked at various communities within Hillsborough County. This is a graph of household non-American speaking homes. So when we go into the coastal areas, we know that we have to send people that can speak Spanish and other languages. Next slide, please. And then this is just a composite of multiple initiatives that we and variations that we created in this program. Next slide. I'll turn my attention pretty soon to water, but last thing is the risk. We looked at the risk, which is hazard, time sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. So our job is to reduce the vulnerability, become less sensitive and more adaptive to these hurricanes that we will get. We've had them, we've always had them, and we'll get more, and they seemingly are getting stronger. Next slide. So I'll turn my attention to saltwater intrusion. Florida is a populous state. In our county alone, we have over 1,000 new residents per month. That's 1,000 new residents per month move to our county and have been moving our county. With that, and throughout Florida, we're seeing that influx. You see additional groundwater withdrawal. With groundwater withdrawal combined with sea level rise, you get saltwater intrusion. So if you look at the left side of where the coastline is, you'll see sea level rise or saltwater intrusion into the groundwater system. And the slide on the right shows the chlorides and TDS increasing in the drinking water aquifers. Next slide. So what we do and what we created was a system of wells, which are green. Those are a series of wells laterally down the coast. And this model shows the impact of 10 million gallons a day of reclaimed water injected into the saltwater zone, which on the eastern side or western side is saltwater. And when you go to the east, that same zone turns fresh. So what we're doing is we're augmenting the pressure in that zone to create more water, more fresh water in that system, and hold back and retard the saltwater intrusion. In this one at 10 MGD, you can see almost 300 square miles of recovery from a half a foot to 40 feet of recovery in the aquifer. Next slide. So next, we're going to play a little video for you to give you a summary of the SHARP project.
Hillsborough County has many water resources. We have Tampa Bay, lakes and streams, we have rivers, and we have reclaimed water. Even so, water is a limited resource, and we have to conserve, protect, and preserve it. We're going to continue to develop projects that allow us to wisely use the water resources we have, all of them. This is our wise use commitment. Hillsborough County operates one of the largest retail reclaimed water systems in the U.S. Every day, we provide 22 million gallons of reclaimed water to customers who use it at homes, businesses, and industry. But we have more reclaimed water to use. Reclaimed water is safe, and it's always going to be available. Better still, for every gallon of reclaimed water we use, we save a gallon of potable water, and that saves money and is good for the environment. It costs a lot to treat the water. Our reclaimed water is treated to such a high standard that its quality is in the top 2% of all recycled water in the U.S. Experts say it's better than the water many people in the world drink every day. So it doesn't make sense to just throw it away. That's why our wise use policy is smart economically and environmentally. We want to maximize the benefit of our investment. We want to use reclaimed water to manage a threat to our potable water. For decades, the salty water from Tampa Bay has been moving very slowly inland. The movement is slow and it's deep underground and out of sight. It's called saltwater intrusion. In southeast Hillsborough, near the TICO plant, freshwater resources have already been contaminated by saltwater. Drinking and irrigation wells have had to be capped. In order to keep the salty water from moving even further into our freshwater resources, we're going to inject highly treated reclaimed water between them. This reclaimed water will be very deep underground, far, far below any irrigation or drinking water wells. By recharging the deep coastal aquifer with reclaimed water through a series of wells, we create a barrier to the movement of salt water. Better still, we add back pressure to the natural system. What does that pressure do? It's a big bubble. It's like putting marbles in a glass of water. The marbles stay put, but the water levels lift. That can help protect shallower private wells, lakes, ponds, and all the related environmental resources. Adding a balloon of high-quality reclaimed water between the fresh and salt water increases pressure to keep the salty water in Tampa Bay and the fresh water available for us. Good for the community, good for the environment, good way to protect our investment and our quality of life. Hillsborough County is managing all of our water resources to protect our investment and the environment. Water is water. It's our job to make sure that all of our water is put to wise use.
Last slide. So that was 10 MGD. This is potential 20 million gallons per day of recharge. And you can see over 600 square miles of recovery of the freshwater aquifer where we can pull water out. So it's an indirect potable reuse system. And it's the way a lot of us need to start utilizing our reclaimed water, extra water we traditionally threw away. Thank you very much. And I look forward to any questions.
Thanks very much, Bart. I do have a couple of questions for you, and then I'll follow those with some questions for Jay. I also wanted to let everyone know that we've reopened the Zoom chat. So if it feels more intuitive to enter your questions directly into Zoom going forward, you're welcome to do that. So Bart, to start, would love to know if you've noticed any changes in the way your community reacts to the term of climate change in the past few years, and how the politics around that term impact your resiliency efforts.
Sure. Then there has been a change. More people are educated on it. And I see that our local governments are changing, especially when we see evidence of sea level rise. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when we'll see sea level impacts. So that's why we have more support now than we've had in the previous decades to get in front of this issue and work together with other communities to do so.
Great. Thanks very much. I have one more for you. Did the vulnerability study look at legacy or hazardous sites that will be impacted by sea level rise? And if so, can you talk about the strategies for addressing those?
Sure. It identifies landfills and other hazardous sites. And so it identifies them as terms of where they're located and what type of natural event they would be susceptible to, so that we can flag them if they're in a low area or close to a riverine system and threatened at a lower level of sea level rise, let's say, so that we can prioritize working on them to either remove them or work on them to make them more resilient to these impacts.
Thanks very much, Bart. Question for Jay. Can you talk more about what you are doing in collaboration with the city of Saskatoon?
Sure thing. So right now we are working with the city to do monitoring of wastewater for COVID-19. And so getting some, advance warning on what's happening, and it's not looking good. But we're also just partnering and trying to, just had a meeting actually a couple of weeks ago, identifying a number of projects that can be funded through a joint city university funding pool for things like, ranging from smart metering to source water protection and projects like that.
Thanks very much. And one more for you. Can you share if your work with GRACE or how it's impacted water management or policy?
Sure. Yeah. So there's a couple of really important examples. One of our first big papers was on northwestern India. You might remember it showed up as a hotspot in that global map. And that work inspired a national hydrogeological mapping effort across the country. So pretty impactful there. And in California, many people in academics were working on groundwater issues and water issues during the successive droughts. But when I was there and working, especially from the period, say 2010 to 2014, Our work was pretty impactful in helping get, and especially images like that 3-panel image I showed of the sort of like the red, yellow, green, that sort of communication was really important in getting the conversation out into the public and out of just, the state legislature, and it really engaged the public and helped provide the ammunition for getting the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act on the ballot and ultimately passed.
Great. Thanks very much. And I have one more quick one for Bart, and then we're going to jump into, and I see we have more questions. We are going to have breakouts where you'll get to talk more with the speakers. But quickly, Bart, can you talk about the sources of the reclaimed water you're using?
The sources of reclaimed water are municipal plants, our municipal system that is wastewater that's treated to a very high level in Tampa Bay. We've recovered the ecology of Tampa Bay because our wastewater plants and the nitrogen consortium around the bay created a initiative that we needed to treat to just give you one example, treat our nutrient levels down to very low levels, better than what is legal for drinking water. That is just one example. Nitrogen, we have to meet a level of 3 milligrams per liter annually and in our discharge, and we typically are at 1.7 to 2 milligrams per liter. Drinking water can have 10 milligrams per liter. So it's very, very clean water, and that's what we allude to. So that very clean water is used to recharge this saline portion of the groundwater system along the coast.
Thank you, Bart. And I'm going to hold Lauren's question so that we have a chance to hear from all of the speakers today. Jared, let's hear from you.
Well, thank you all for having me. Being able to be part of this group is fantastic, and I really appreciate the thoughts that both Jay and Bart have already put out there. So again, I'm from Durango, Colorado, and going to give a little bit more of a Western United States perspective. A little less notable or noticeable, not known quite as well as Tampa Bay, but Durango, Colorado is kind of in between. When I looked at Jay's map of at least the United States area, we're kind of in between two of those big hotspots. And could you go to the next slide, please? So again, we are 3.5 hours to Albuquerque, New Mexico, 6 hours to Denver, those still in the same state, it's a good wide distance, 6.5 to Salt Lake, and 7.5 hours to Phoenix. And again, thinking about those hot spots, we're kind of sandwiched between the Rio Grande River Basin that flows to our east, and we are in the Colorado River Basin, a tributary. The San Juan River is a tributary to the Colorado. So any of that, reuse water that we are losing, it actually makes it down to LA, Phoenix, and other points out in the Colorado River Basin. So go ahead, next slide. In our community, it's known as a community that is very outdoors oriented. You can see we've got skiing. That's our in-town ski hill on the leftmost picture. In the middle of summer, we've got the Animas River that bisects our community. We've got amazing, great mountain biking all throughout our community and region. And we are the home of the Durango and Silverton Narrow Gauge Railway. So those, we've got a great tourism economy, and those have given us a lot of great assets within our community. But what I wanted to talk about a little more, and you can go to the next slide, what we're noticing maybe a little bit more. Oh, there we go. What we're noticing a little bit more, and these are water related issues, are legacy mining. So one way that a lot of people might recognize Durango is we were the location. The Animas River was the river that had a large mine spill from the Gold King mine. A bulkhead up there was actually penetrated when they were doing work, and it made our river, mustard yellow for about 3 days. The other things that we're seeing are that middle picture is more forest fires and more persistence of fire weather. Funny enough, here we are in April, and there are fire weather watches out there today. And so, we have had to become more accustomed and prepare so much more for these additional challenges. And then all the way to the left, that was just this last fall when we are seeing record low levels on the Animas River, which is one of our sources of supply for water. We've seen record lows within the 105-year records that we have on that river. And so what I wanted to at least talk about is, how do you plan for a higher frequency? And how have we been planning for a higher frequency of say, mishap and climate-induced problems with our water supply? Please go to the next slide. So one of the ways, and one of the kind of the best ways in my experience, was actually going through a process. This was called a VCAPS, or Vulnerability, Consequences, and Adaptation Planning process, with a group of academics and other practitioners from Western Water Assessment. So they actually helped us. They facilitated a session for kind of a cross section of our city staff. We also had some county representatives, representative of our local university. And they facilitated a session for us to sit down and have a conversation on the vulnerabilities of our community to all of these issues. So, we had this session back in 2018 when it was a pretty extreme drought year for us. So naturally, we started discussing both drought, but also, weather variability and flash flood planning as well. But one of the biggest takeaways that we were able to derive from this exercise was the ability to sit down, and both Jay and Bart said it in other ways, but sit down and collaborate with people around the table. And this facilitated method was phenomenal, where we didn't have to take notes. We could kind of have a discussion amongst ourselves and really put our ideas on the table and discuss them. The other really big takeaway from that was we actually included members of our city council. And that has borne a lot of value to us, because that conversation started a chain reaction of support from city council back to staff, from staff back out to the community, and really fostered collaboration. And please go to the next slide. So through that collaboration, we have been able to develop a number of different valuable assets, from our sustainability action plans, and our comprehensive plan that was completed in late 2017 or mid to late 2017. We've integrated some of these ideas, water conservation ideas, price signals, into our rate studies. And we've actually completed documents where we're identifying what's going to happen in our next case of drought. We've got notches. We've got a plan together. And again, I want to stress the value of having our our community decision makers at the table with us, and having them in a good way push us to integrate, this resilience to climate change planning into our operations. So with that, I will kick it over to whoever's coming up next.
Thanks, Jared. I do have a question for you. Has Durango undertaken community outreach strategies to talk about the need for wildfire and watershed management, and how important are such efforts?
We have in a couple different ways. So funny enough, we just completed our a water master plan sentiment survey. And within that document, one of the intentions is outreach to discuss what conservation strategies people are putting priority on throughout our community. And in addition, I think, again, we've been engaging with some other community partners as well in conversations around, be it Fort Lewis, our local university, through their water center and others. We've been able to kind of push a conversation about what does our water future look like, and how, our water and wildfire, they're inextricably linked, because we rely on source supplies, or on surface supplies, that is. When there is a fire, we have a water quality problem, and we have to manage that. And being able to really tell that story in an understandable way has been very important, and our community has reacted well to it.
Thanks. One more question. You mentioned that it was important to include city council members in the assessment process. Can you talk about any changes that flowed from that?
Yeah, I would say we had one particular council member who really became a spark plug for change. When we went through that vulnerability analysis, we got a lot of support from that counselor, both in meetings, in community meetings around town, to push us to keep that line of questioning. There was kind of a renewed appreciation for the work we were doing, and I would say maybe a little more than a gentle nudge to push harder and push further. And that kind of push from a council level, it gives staff a little bit more, leeway to really maybe make a couple or take a little bit more risk and move ahead, maybe at a pace we otherwise thought we couldn't.
Wonderful. Thanks, Jared. We're going to hear next from Peter Kelly Detweiler from Northbridge Energy Partners.
Thank you. Yes, I come at this from a completely different perspective. I've been involved in power grids for the last 30 years. And one of the things that's striking is how much increasing interaction there is between these various systems. Next slide, please. So we learned from mid-February, if we didn't know it before, that the interdependencies between the water and the electricity system can be very costly if they don't work. And this was in Texas, where they spent not only the $46 to $50 billion on the excess cost for power, even with half of the state blacked out, but because it was so cold and because they were supposed to have had rotating outages and they ended up being permanent outages for 4 days in some instances, we had water coming out of people's ceilings, as you can see on the fan on the right, toilets freezing, and over $18 billion so far of expected water damage, making this alone just from water damage bigger than most hurricanes in terms of damage. And this is just frozen pipes. So that's one interaction that most people don't think about. Next slide, please. As a power system expert, I suppose you could call me, one of the things that we look at is, where do we use water in the system? And we see many times now particularly because of climate change, that we can't cool our thermal generating plants. So if you're burning something, whether it's coal or you have a fission process for nukes or you're burning natural gas, you typically need water to cool those plants. Where I live in Massachusetts, we did lose Tom Brady to Tampa Bay, but still we got him more than you ever will. But nonetheless, so we had 2 cooling plants here for a coal-fired plant that were, before they were erected because it reduced water consumption, there was once through cooling from the local bay that was sucking 1 billion gallons of water every single day out of the bay and just killing the fish population. So they were forced, the utility was, to build 2 500-foot cooling towers at a cost of $570 million. And so water is critical for that. In fact, some of the local siting, there was a gas-fired plant that was supposed to be sited locally. They couldn't get cooling water for it. And then obviously, besides the cooling water, and then, we had the Pilgrim nuclear plant that was so warm a couple of summers ago before they did shut that plant down permanently, they could only run it at half power because the cooling water in the bay, Cape Cod Bay, was above the thermal limits set by the EPA. So they simply couldn't bring the water into the plant and heat it up and dump it back into the bay because they were already over the limits. Then you've got issues like hydropower, obviously a critical source of electricity in certain parts of the country, like the Pacific Northwest, even affecting California. So last year when California had those 2 outages of 500 megawatts one day and 1,000 megawatts the next, part of the reason why is they couldn't get enough hydropower across the critical transmission infrastructure. So that's a critical piece, and that's all changing because of rainfall levels. And in fact, this spring, we're probably going to see a lot lower hydropower in the California power system just because we didn't get the snowfall up in the Sierras we often get. So the meltwater is different. So we don't get as much hydropower into the system. And then on the demand side of it, the largest load in many cities is that water pumping and sewage treatment. 3 to 4% of total US electricity use is for water. And I'm sure that's a pretty big component. And the Hillsborough project is the electricity used for moving all that water and pumping it 10 million gallons a day. Next slide, please. So one of the things that's struck me over the years as I look at water, I look at data, that sort of thing, is some of the similarities we see. Yes, we have the interdependencies we talked about, but we also see similarities. Water is in many ways similar to electric utilities in that you have a natural utility, one set of pipelines in one instance, is wires and poles in another. Electricity is just in time though. It's the only commodity on the planet that's produced and consumed instantaneously. Water, you can store it sometimes for years. But what's changing now in the power system is we're now starting to develop batteries. And so we're starting to see, for example, this year in California, probably 30,000 homes had batteries installed. And the same thing is happening in the water system on a really micro level with people's rain barrels. So for example, a couple of years ago, we had a really bad drought here where I am. And I used to be the president of the local watershed. All the local streams were dry. And the only way I could keep my garden going was I basically had a distributed micro system, which was my rain barrel. And 50 gallons of water was enough to keep my garden alive, but there was a tremendous drain on the system, so you could see the bottom of the local reservoir. As we start to think about resiliency in our systems, both whether it's electricity, where we're starting to look at the ways we can digitize the electric system, see how people are using power, when they're using it, and how flexible some of their various appliances are. By the same token, we can do more around digitizing our water system, tracking leaks, figuring out where the water is going, when it's going, how much is being consumed, how much gets from point A to point B, and how much is lost in the middle. And also starting to build out more of a distributed infrastructure, either by starting to utilize more gray water for lawns and other low value utilization of water, or rain barrels, or even cisterns. There's a lot of water that typically falls in a given year. Most of it makes its way to the ocean. Also critical for the infrastructure. Don't get me wrong, we shouldn't capture all of it, but there are ways we can build more distributed systems in the power grid and in our water grid. and digitize more of that over time so that we have more intelligence applied to the when, the where, the how much, and the how. Next slide, please. This is just a slide basically looking at, ironically, I pulled the slide when I found it, looking at making things more efficient on the end use side for electricity. This is a thermographic camera looking at heat leaking out of a home. So you can figure out how much electricity, if you have electric heat, or how much natural gas or oil you're wasting because you're leaking heat. But the thing that's so interesting about the slide, this was actually used to find problems in a home, and it was locating water leaks. So here's a technology that actually can be used for 2 different applications. So again, just another view of how more intelligence can be brought to bear at the edge. We call it the grid edge in power markets. You must have some similar phrase in the water world. Next slide, please. Here's another view of resilience. This is Texas. This is the whole city blacked out. One home had solar on the rooftop and batteries in the garage. So they found a way around this problem. You got, obviously not everyone can afford that, but it does make the grid more resilient the more people that do have these kinds of end use applications in storage and generation. Next slide, please. Hawaii, a similar sort of thing. So Hawaii's been at the cutting edge for a lot of issues around renewables, storage, and generation. And it is probably the leading grid in the country and perhaps the world. In fact, several years ago, the CEO of Florida's utility, Florida Power and Light and NextEra, referred to Hawaii as a postcard from the future. They're actually looking at getting 100% of their power grid to be carbon-free by 2045. One of the things they intend to do is to have fully 50% of the electrons moving through the grid happening at the customer side, being generated or stored at the customer side, on the customer side of the meter. So they are one of the most advanced grids in thinking about how you engage the customer, how you provide them with dynamic pricing signals, how you bring more intelligence into the platforms, and essentially create these little microgrids in sort of a fractal view of the larger system, all informed by data platforms. Next slide, please. So the power grid has been having to deal with a lot of these issues in large part because you cannot store it because of that production instantaneous consumption thing. And we spend $1 billion a day on electricity. So there's a fair amount of money being involved in that, and the grids are fairly large. So now we're having something similar being developed in our water grids. So we're both trying to get to the same outcomes, power and water. We're probably going to see very parallel approaches to a lot of these things. And with that, I leave it to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. I do have a question for you.
Sure.
Would love for you to talk about what lessons the water sector might learn from the energy sector about how to pay for decentralized infrastructure.
Yeah, where we start with electricity is what's the avoided cost and what's the value to the system. So for example, what does it cost to treat and move water? If you look at it from a systemic perspective and then say, okay, what's therefore the avoided cost, and what might it be worth, for example, to put in efficient shower heads or minimize leaks in toilets and flowing valves and that sort of thing. Once you know your costs, both centrally and then your distributed costs, you can figure out what the avoided costs are and develop the benefit cost analysis for how to prioritize what investments to put where. And if you digitize it, you get a much better sense and a visual overview of everything that's happening.
Great, thanks. And I just got another. Avoided cost is not a conventional approach in the water space. How do you recommend we make this shift?
Oh, yeah, it is a mindset difference. I think it's ultimately, look, we pay for water, we pay for electricity. Electricity is much more granular because it's so time dependent. But I think it's a good place to start is understanding, for example, if I were in San Diego and I ran out of water and the next thing I had to do was build a desal plant. Now I know I have a huge amount of avoided costs that I'm facing, and anything I can do not to build that desal plan. The first thing you do is you look at what's the next marginal investment you would have to make in the absence of taking some other action. And that often helps you figure out what that avoided cost can be, and then you work from there.
Great. Thanks very much, Peter. So we've heard about groundwater depletion, we've heard about flooding and saltwater intrusion, heard about fires and drought, and the interdependence of energy and water, as well as the need to shift towards decentralized solutions and embrace efficiency. And so I'm going to try to bring all of these risks together and talk about how we make the case and build support for solutions. Next slide, please. And I'll say I'm a communications strategist by trade. I work for a whole bunch of groups that are trying to change water policy as well as water behaviors. And I spend a lot of time studying polling, commissioning polls, and also analyzing media coverage. And so I'm going to share a little bit of research and then some recommendations grounded in that research. Next slide, please. So to start, the good news, this is from the water main, is that people care deeply about water. It is the least polarized partisan environmental issue with real potential to be a unifier because it is literally something that we touch and taste every day. Next slide, please. This is from Gallup's annual environmental survey. For the past 25 years, they've been asking voters, what are they worried about in the environmental world? And pollution of drinking water has topped the list every single year, followed closely by pollution of rivers, lakes, and reservoirs. Next slide, please. This is a poll that my organization, the Water Hub, just pulled from the field in March. We often ask people what they perceive as risks to water safety. And we specifically asked this question ahead of what we knew was going to be an infrastructure proposal that included water. And, source pollution is the top threat, but outdated water systems is right up there. People are slowly beginning to grasp that we have been underinvesting in water and that things like climate change are really pushing the limits of our current systems, requiring a whole lot of investment to ensure ongoing access, safety, and affordability. Next slide, please. This is from a Pew 2020 survey. My organization also frequently polls questions about climate concerns, and concerns have been edging up year over year. This is specifically about extreme weather, and a strong majority of people are very or somewhat concerned. And when we ask specifically, we see specific concerns vary by region. So in the Mid-Atlantic, you'll hear more concerns about flooding, as well as in the Gulf region. In the West, you certainly see more about drought and fire, but people are perceiving a change to precipitation and a change to weather. And the good news is that they also support preventative action. They want us to prepare. Next slide, please. This is from Yale Climate Communications, which asked about infrastructure priorities recently. And water system updates was the second most popular option right after roads and bridges in terms of what we ought to prioritize for infrastructure investments, which I think is remarkable considering how invisible most of our water system is, being that it is underfoot. And I chose this slide specifically because they broke it down by party affiliation, and you can see how little variation there is. And I can share all the links to the polls where you can look at the crosstabs and see that other issues there's a much greater spread depending on party affiliation. Next slide, please. So that's the public opinion landscape. And next I want to share some of the information landscape, what people are reading and hearing and watching that helps them understand these issues. Next slide. So to start, I'll just say There's been a lot of water news lately, and it often is driven by weather, including extreme weather events. Next slide, please. Water is really the face of climate change, whether we're talking about flooding or we're talking about, a fire season that is now starting in April and extending into winter, or we're talking about, the amount of water that farmers can expect in the Central Valley of California as groundwater levels drop, as Jay was talking about earlier. It is the way that people are experiencing and understanding climate change. Next slide. So the problems are reasonably well understood, although the detail about them that you've heard from speakers today, I would say is, a bit more than the average person might be exposed to. But where things get tricky is the solutions. We tend to talk about water management and water infrastructure in really technical terms, which means that we're missing an opportunity to leverage the strong support that there is for water investments because we haven't connected the dots. Next slide. So just a funny little snapshot of some of the language that we use. Stormwater was on the last slide. The language of water is not super accessible to people. And so for you as water leaders, if you could be translators and ambassadors that are using terms and pick, imagery and events that people are experiencing and connect to their lives and livelihoods, that will help us tap into what is already strong support. Next slide, please. So just quickly, I want to share some big picture recommendations for communicating around the water and climate solutions that many of you are working on. Next slide. To start, let's focus on the benefit of the solutions that you're all working on versus the technical details. I talk about the why versus the how, or the payoff versus the process. That's where we are able to build support, and then we can follow with the technical details. Next slide. Next, the good news is, as I said, water is part of everyone's lives. And so if we focus on core values like health and safety that we know are literally being threatened in communities across the country, whether we're talking about, contamination of groundwater, which is going to drive up treatment costs and potentially make it less safe to drink, or we're talking about, the threats to people's homes from wildfires, there are shared values at stake, but sometimes we fail to mention that and sort of take for granted that people understand them. Next slide. And then the last thing is work with the seasons. While I know you all are working on and preparing for vulnerabilities year round, there are times of the year when certain threats are more visible to your customers, your constituents, to other decision makers. And so I would just recommend working with those seasons so that you don't have to start from a place of education. And with that, I will wrap up and invite questions.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Nicole. And we do have one question here. It sort of echoes Jared's comments around his council members' involvement in their climate resilience planning. What specific role do you think local leaders should be playing in communicating with constituents about climate impacts in their communities?
I think that local leaders are tremendously important spokespeople. And as I said, I think that local leaders can be that bridge who can talk about what this looks like on the ground. So, in the case of the Texas freeze that Peter was just talking about, local leaders can really share how this is impacting people's lives and what we can do to prepare in the future and what we're doing now to restore water service, to ensure ongoing water safety, both in the relief and recovery effort, as well as the resiliency and adaptation effort. So it's really about people aren't interested in the sort of broad theory. They're interested in the applications in their lives and how it's going to ensure the water service that they rely on.
Excellent. Thank you, Nicole. And I think we will now transition into our breakout activity for the remainder of the session. So we're going to be dividing up into groups of about 8 folks. Some of our groups will have one of today's speakers in their rooms. Some of those I'll just ask for those that don't have a speaker for you to discuss amongst yourself. And the question we'll be talking about is, what did you hear today that may help you to address your water-related climate challenges? So we'll just give Jesse a moment here to create the breakout rooms. And once you're in those breakout rooms, I'll encourage you to unmute and turn on your video to participate in that discussion. Welcome back, everyone. We'll just give folks another minute here to join us.
Okay, fantastic. I hope you had good conversations in your breakout rooms. We would love to have you go back to the Pathable link and share one word that reflects something you learned from this session, please. All right. Looks like we're having some technical difficulties because we're getting more submissions than are showing in the word cloud. So apologies for that. We'd love to have the speakers now share a very brief thumbnail sketch of the conversations in your rooms, starting with Jay.
Sorry to interrupt, Nicole. Maybe before we do so, that they did show up on my screen, so I'll just read out a few of the key terms listed here. We've got collaboration, nexus, communication, resilience, sort of those frontline key terms that it looks like many folks listed. We've also got solutions, bipartisan, education, adaptability, changing, reuse, planning, and many others. So thank you all for participating in those breakouts and submitting your responses.
Fantastic. Thanks for that. Jay, would you give us a quick snapshot of the discussion in your breakout room?
Sure, yeah. People were happy to learn about green infrastructure, about the importance of and the potential for recycled water, the visuals from some of the work that I showed from Grace. We also lamented that human behavior and maybe the willingness, what does it take to get people to act and to change? It seems like people are not willing to take the big steps that are necessary given the urgency. And so maybe some communication can help on that.
Fantastic, thank you. Bart, would you share from your room?
Sure, it was interesting because we had myself from Florida and then several people from San Francisco, the opposite coast in the United States. And I want to give a plug out to San Francisco Utility, where your number 2 is their number 1. I always love that slogan, and I think we all could use it to educate our people. So we talked about several things, but one of the things that I advised or alluded the group to was that the state of Florida is in the process of passing a discharge moratorium. All wastewater plants that discharge wastewater to surface water bodies in a non-beneficial way will have to cease within 5 years. So there's going to be a lot of work in Florida to make these discharges either beneficial or do something else with them. So good discussions, interesting, especially when we compare notes from California and Florida.
Bart, Jared, how was your room?
So we had a really great conversation, and a lot of the things that were mentioned were, first off, this astonishment that water is a bipartisan issue. Anybody who has sat at a city council meeting or has gone to a city council meeting or is a geek like me and watches city council meetings for fun, sometimes sees water in the crosshairs a little more often. But a few other things, a lot of it came down to, the same thing. And Bart said it, great sloganeering, communication, being a water ambassador, and also how to make your ideas, your communications scalable in some way, and maybe partnering with private entities, public-private messaging in your community to make to get a broader audience and make it land a little bit wider. So.
Thanks, Jared. Peter?
Yeah, so it was interesting. We had a great conversation around some of the analogs between electricity and water. For example, the PACE program, which supports energy efficiency and renewables, potentially being applied to water. We have all kinds of tax incentives for renewables. There are not that many tax incentives for water. And in some cases, you get rebates, and those rebates are taxable. So you actually get a slap in the face for doing the right thing. And then a discussion around the economies of scale versus diseconomies of scale, and really understanding which things are cost effective and which are not. I would say, to sum it all up, it's really clear there are a lot of tools that can be cross-pollinated in both directions, not just from power to water, but the other way. And I'm hopeful that conversation will pick up steam in the months and years to come.
Fantastic. And my room, we had folks from all across the country and talked about a range of issues from flooding and stormwater pollution to drought and snow melt and evaporation, and talked a lot about how do we get to solutions. So there's pretty good awareness, I think, in the communities of the folks represented about some of the water challenges, and folks were sharing a little bit about how they're trying to change behaviors and policies. And one of the things that I want to lift up is the idea of educating kids who can help bring information and ideas back to their families. And with that, we're going to thank you for spending an hour and a half with us. And I think Lindsay is going to wrap us up.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Nicole. And I'd like to thank all of our speakers again for their presentations today and their real dedication to this very challenging issue. And of course, all of our attendees for your participation. And if Jesse can just pull up our slide, thank you. Last but certainly not least, our wonderful sponsors who have really made this event happen. We hope that you'll all stay on the line now to join us for our closing thoughts on day one, where we'll be sharing common themes from today's World Café activity that you may have participated in a bit earlier. And now I'll be turning it over to Cynthia Kohler, WaterNow's Executive Director, and Walt Wadlow, our Utility Relations Director, to share some of those comments.
Thanks, Lindsay. And I'm going to add my thanks to the panel. It was fantastic. I'm really grateful for all of you. Thanks for everybody for being with us for the first day of this event. We haven't done it virtually before, so it's exciting to be in this space. And I think Walt is going to be talking about some of our gamification, and then we're gonna share with you some of the insights we're able to pull together from the World Café. So with that, Walt.
Thank you, Cynthia. Before we launch into a report out on the World Café from this morning, I just wanted to remind everybody to participate in the What Are We Winning contest, our point collecting game that gives you an opportunity to win a selection of great prizes. Everyone's automatically enrolled in the game, and you accrue points by joining in on activities throughout the event. If you add a session to your agenda, you watch a webinar, you download sponsor materials, you participate in a poll, all of these will earn you points. So check out the What Are We Winning tab on your Pathable session, the way you logged in today, to get more details, see the prizes, and also to track your points on the leaderboard. Very important for those of you who are super competitive. We have 3 grand prizes that we will award at the end of the event. And you can also win great raffle prizes by attending our sponsor networking sessions. Visit our sponsor Zoom rooms to learn about their products and services, ask questions, and speak with them live. And in fact, we have our first raffle prize winner from our noontime sessions today, and that is Karen Zembel, who's a commissioner with the Princeton Environmental Commission. So congratulations to Karen. We'll be in touch and figure out how to get you your brand new Tesla Roadster. So with that, I would encourage everybody to participate both in What Are We Winning and in the raffles by participating in the sponsor networking sessions. And with that, I'd like to turn us to our report out on the World Café. We had a great World Café this morning, lots of very active discussion. We had nearly 100 individual comments, which were captured by our table leads this morning. And once again, thank you to all of our table leads for doing a great job. What we did offline during the day while you were attending sessions is some of the Water Now Alliance staff read through all of the comments that were captured, and we put those into categories that were driven by the content of the comments that you made. And we came up with 10 categories, and we've divided up the individual comments that were captured by the table leads into these 10 categories. And so the grouping fell out this way. And again, this is driven by the content of the actual comments. We had lots of comments on outreach and education related to the water topics under discussion today. We had comments about equity in water distribution and related health issues. We had comments about the future nature of utilities, rethinking our business, technology, and how we can apply it. We had comments on affordability and finance, conversations around One Water and sustainability, and even some questions that were specific to stormwater, both issues that need to be dealt with and specific questions about it as a resource. We had infrastructure questions that got discussion in the breakout rooms. We also had public health and multiple benefits questions. We had questions on climate change and also questions on leadership challenges. So we took all of the questions, all of the comments that were made, grouped them into these 10 categories. And what Cynthia and I are going to do now is just run through each of those categories and just give you a sense for some of the comments that came in as a way of reporting back to you on the really good work that was done by the participants in the World Café this morning. So I'll go ahead and start. And I'm going to start by talking about the first category, which is outreach, education, and communication. We had all of these following comment areas under discussion in the various breakout rooms. Want to learn more about munis and how we talk to residents about rate increases due to aging infrastructure. So see, it's that sense of, yes, it talks about rate increases in infrastructure, but the question is, we want to learn about how municipalities are talking to residents about those increases. So that's really an outreach and education. Want to find ways to get messages across about how important water is, transforming the landscapes from turf to native landscaping. Questions about how to communicate water quality issues, how to take the water conversation out to the world. Let's stop talking just among ourselves. And so what's being captured here are the reasons that people come to the Water Now Alliance Summit, that they're the driving factors in the local community that give rise to these questions. We had a discussion about expanding the conversation on water shortage and educating everybody on the importance of water, the lack of trust in tap water. And I'm sure that that has been impacted by what happened in Flint. We had a comment specifically from Colorado about the very severe water shortages and the need to upgrade water treatment plants, aging infrastructure, and the need to double rates to pay for all this. And at the end of the day, how to overcome the mistrust with better communication. We had a comment from a new council member, which said, we increased rates and it didn't go over very well. We're interested in learning more about what other cities do with people talking about sustainability and conservation and everything else you can do to save water. We had comments about the common issues and solutions out there necessary to meet community water needs. And again, want to learn more about what municipalities are doing to talk to their residents about rate increases, especially due to aging infrastructure. Somebody wanted to find ways to get messages across about how important water is and the transformation of landscapes. Another question about how to communicate water quality issues, how to get information out to build community support for water projects, how we advocate to the federal government for these priorities, and then the challenges of communicating with residents. In other words, trying to get them past thinking that we conserve just to conserve. Additionally, and this is really a leadership challenge and an outreach and education issue, an approach at the beginning of the pandemic to make a big public push that tap water was safe. There was another topic under discussion that said it's easier to connect with people because you don't have to travel these days. And then interestingly, one on the other side that said doing everything on Zoom makes it almost impossible to communicate with people. Lots of observations about the importance of communication. An interesting comment about wastewater and testing wastewater in Tempe to look at opioid use. A comment about how you communicate the results of that. And the individual indicated they are a member of the Navajo Nation, and they realized that their neighbors don't have running water, and how do you get information and communication out about that topic? Another person observed that people have stress limits and good communication is absolutely key. This category was the largest of all the categories under discussion this morning at the World Café, as it often is, outreach and education. More about raising rates, the challenges of Zoom, and that the pandemic has taught us that we need a different way to engage individuals with their utilities. So that's kind of a quick run through of what we saw in the largest of the categories, which is outreach and education. And Cynthia, I'll turn it over to you to talk about equity, access, and related health.
Sure. And thanks again to everybody who did participate in the World Café. It's always exciting to make this transition from the in-person to virtual space. So we'd love your feedback when we send out the evaluations about how that all went. There were a lot of comments about equity and access, and that I'm just going to summarize because it really came down to a few major themes, which is that the pandemic has really focused utilities on the importance of universal access to water and its relation to public health. Obviously, they knew this before, but it's really what we're hearing from all of you is that this situation over the last year has elevated those issues in the public conversation in a way it hasn't been before. And related to that is the need to find equitable and sustainable ways of paying for ensuring that we are providing water in safe, healthy, reliable water to everybody equally. You're also thinking more about the disproportionate impact of drought and flooding on communities of color and lower income residents and what to do about this. And bound up with the equity concerns, and this came out and Walt's alluded to it now, it also came out in our session with local leaders this morning, is this issue of trust, that given concerns about equity, longstanding concerns about equity and access to safe water and the negative effects of increased cost of water, you are all thinking about how to best build public trust, particularly in communities of color, and how to alleviate those concerns and build that confidence in the efficacy and the safety of public water supply. On the solutions side of the equation, we also heard that green infrastructure solutions, especially those related to stormwater management, can be helpful in addressing equity concerns, or there's some hope at least that they can be, by providing important community co-benefits, lowering rates, and generating long-term jobs. So a lot of interest in that as a solution set. So I will now kick it back to Walt to talk about the future nature of utilities and rethinking our business.
Thank you, Cynthia. We had a number of different comments that ran along the lines of what does the future of utilities look like? How do we rethink our business and how do we incorporate technology? So we had comments about disparate organizations potentially being siloed. How do we use technology to bring organizations together? We had some conversation about public versus private utilities and the relative roles that they will play in the future. And also, how do we go from the traditional approach, which is expand our system, build more traditional infrastructure? How do we rethink that and find a new solution going forward? And then some interest and questions around how to incorporate technology into what we do as utilities. And also about the role of utilities, how to understand special districts and the value that they can add to addressing infrastructure. And then some questions also about future financing. Will financing of utilities look different in the future? Some observations about the pandemic and the fact that we may have learned something about how to work more effectively from diverse locations. And finally, looking at the impacts of climate change, and will that have a significant impact on how utilities operate in the future? And it will be different. And as we work to improve our sustainable infrastructure, are we able to engage people in jobs that we haven't really considered before to help improve our system? So really interesting topic there. And back to Cynthia to talk about affordability and finance.
Yes, the always popular subject of affordability and finance. This really boils down to something fairly simple. A lot of you came with very similar concerns. Infrastructure is expensive, and never more so than at a time like this. Rates are going up to pay for needed supply, treatment, distribution systems. A lot of the finance issues, as we've touched on, are already communications issue. How do you educate the public about the need to invest to build the support you need for the increased spending that is essential? Interestingly, when the issues got broken down, the conversations took some interesting turns. While it's hard to raise rates for drinking water, it can be even more challenging, we heard from you this morning, to finance stormwater, because not every municipality or utility has a dedicated funding stream for this. So those solutions can really lag. That said, on the solution side, some of your ideas include ramping up the state revolving fund programs so that they're more of a grant system, at least for lower income communities. There's also a lot of interest expressed in learning about financing options for distributed greener stormwater infrastructure, and specifically how publicly funded utilities can access greater capital and support businesses to deliver projects. There was some interest in gaining an understanding, just learning more generally about green options. You know, do we have to pay for this all out of operating funds? Are there federal programs? Are there state programs that can help support those? A lot of interest in learning that we heard this morning. And finally, a number of you noticed that the regulations intended to protect public health do impose restrictions that are expensive. So obviously everybody wants their water to be safe and clean, but these systems generate costs that can generate a challenging dynamic for cash-strapped cities. You don't want to ever have to be in a position where you're choosing between public health and affordability. All of this finally has been exacerbated by the pandemic. Poverty rates are up, incomes are down, utility revenues are down, critical investments are being delayed. So those are the challenges that we're finding the community that has gathered here are addressing. So back to Walt to talk about One Water and sustainability.
Thank you, Cynthia. And another major discussion topic this morning was the concept of one water. The idea that stormwater, wastewater, and water we traditionally think of as water supply are really a single resource, and that they constitute one water in terms of dealing with water systems, how you apply more sustainable infrastructure to that, and how you use localized distributed infrastructure to make it happen. So there were questions about how do we accomplish this integration? How do we make that one water approach easier? And also, how do we connect that to climate change? We know climate change has an impact on water, but how do we connect it to our integration of all of those sources? How we balance water conservation with worries that more development will use the saved water if somebody has a development concern. Some discussion around desalination and the role that that will play as part of a one water approach. And then, of course, once again, climate change impacts, trying to figure out how much they will have an impact and how do we integrate that into a one water approach. And back to Cynthia to talk about stormwater, one of those waters.
Well, this is going to be very short because stormwater seems to be pervading everything. But the one thing we picked out that was specific to this was that were comments about the Biden administration's new programs and how that will play out in the stormwater space. I think we're all still unpacking that, but there was a lot of interest in that. So I think just going forward at Water Now, we'll probably be doing some outreach and education for public utility officials about that because it is a complicated program. There was also an expressed interest in where EPA is going with municipal stormwater program funding. And back to you, Walt, to talk about public health and multi-benefits.
Thank you. One of the really interesting sets of discussions that occurred this morning was how to connect water initiatives and water infrastructure to multiple kinds of benefits. Water systems appropriately managed have obvious public health value, But how do you also accomplish multiple benefits with that? Can you turn a stormwater facility into something that recharges water into the ground, for example? We had one participant who identified themselves as being a participant from Finland and talked about a community that gets very pure water from the tundra snows, that they're melting sooner now and changing the picture, and that it's increasingly important to figure out how to care for that public health benefit of water while you also try and achieve multiple other benefits. Another discussion around the need to connect water quality to health and public health, and the concept that it's very important to look at that, not just with regard to the environmental impacts, but also to whether or not it's equitable and affordably provided. Back to you, Cynthia, for infrastructure.
Alrighty. As you can tell, infrastructure was thematically discussed at throughout the World Cafe sessions. In addition to what's been covered already, what jumped out at me is that the pandemic has revealed more about the absolute need to be more proactive about investing in infrastructure, about not deferring maintenance, upgrades, and investments in new systems, which is really where most utilities are. Infrastructure is going to be at the center of the federal and local financing conversation going forward. What is that relationship to be? As we've said several times today, 95% of infrastructure spending is happening at the local level. What does that mean for federal support if we're going to get real about making the several $1 trillion of investment that need to be we need going forward? So infrastructure is on everybody's mind at this summit. You also shared that the pandemic has opened avenues to take a more expansive view of infrastructure. It's not just pipes and levees, we heard. We need to also include local solutions like green infrastructure and water use efficiency. We can't use the record of the past to design what we need for the future. So we got a little poetic there this morning. Oh, I'm sorry, back to you, Walt, to talk about climate.
I got it. And climate change is another one of those topics that was woven throughout the discussions, whether it was infrastructure, public health, or the various other topics. Climate change had a way of working into those, but there were also a lot of discussion questions just around climate change itself. An interesting set included how water law might or might not adjust to deal with the impacts of climate change, and whether it needs to, whether there needs to be a more collaborative approach. A number of observations about the Colorado River Basin, the water shortages that they face, and what climate change will bring in the future for that. A discussion about the fact that climate change, whether it's inducing flooding or affecting water supply, changes the distribution and the availability of water. And that in itself becomes an equity issue that's going to need to be dealt with as we move forward into the future. And then finally, a lot of discussion around just trying to understand the climate change impacts and figure out how much water is left, and if there is a way to decide what is a politically acceptable way to move forward on climate change related to water supplies. Back to you, Cynthia, for leadership.
And I think this is our last section. This is a leadership alliance, so it's not surprising that leadership challenges are part of what brought so many of you here today. So here's just a few highlights. City council members in particular have so many issues they're dealing with. A lot of you noted that it's very difficult to find the time and the space to dig in to water as much as you'd like to. We have solutions for you there. Check out the Water 101. I think that's coming up Thursday, but that's on your mind. A number of you were also interested in figuring out how to create space to bring other people on board to discuss water innovation that can benefit your community, but represents change that can be hard. Some of you also noted that there have been some interesting, maybe unexpected silver linings in the changes brought about the pandemic. Utilities have had to pivot and scramble to better reach their constituents. Virtual meetings may actually allow for greater participation, although some of you said not so much. But some of you have found that this has brought your communities together and even your boards together in new ways. You're also learning that there are different ways to engage individuals in their government and their utility that may be beneficial into the future as we get back to a more normal approach. And I think with that, anything else from you, Walt, before we transition to the lounges?
That's it.
Coming up.
Thank you, one and all.
And I'm going to thank you all, but one quick word. We do have coming up a couple of very cool lounges. There's a federal funding lounge where you can hang out and learn more about federal support for your communities. There's also networking lounges with our terrific sponsors. So you have many lounging opportunities at this point in the afternoon. So thank you again. And we look forward to seeing you tomorrow for day 2 of Tap into Resilience.